This committee will come to order. The committee is pleased to see that we have representatives of the BBG, including seated governors like Victor Ashe, with us today, and we look forward to working together and continuing our dialogue as we move forward with legislative reforms. The title of this hearing is Broadcasting Board of Governors, an Agency Defunct. And today we meet to discuss how best to reform the Broadcasting Board of Governors, the agency which oversees U.S. international broadcasters such as the Voice of America and such as Radio Free Asia. Our international broadcasting has a very rich history. Eastern Europeans have told us how critical Radio Free Asia was, Radio Free Europe was at the time, in clipping away at the Iron Curtain, in the ability, as Václav Havel says, to get information out, to operate as a free surrogate radio, to give the people the facts about what was actually happening on the ground in Eastern Europe that otherwise they would not have been able to obtain. And what's interesting in listening to the dialogue, the conversations about those at the time who were privy to listening to those broadcasts, is to hear their explanations about their own thought process as they began to question the totalitarian regimes that were controlling information. It indeed had a profound impact on the course of human events. It was quite an achievement with the end of the Cold War. And while the Voice of America aims to provide listeners with objective news and information about United States foreign policy, the purpose of the surrogate broadcasts, such as Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, is very different. And that is to beam this information into closed societies, giving those citizens the information that otherwise they would never be able to access. Each broadcasting service is full of enterprising reporters who literally risk their lives for what they do. They risk life and limb, and I think all of us have followed stories about individual reporters who were killed in the line of getting the story in totalitarian regimes or reporting on human rights abuses. Reporters from these services really deserve to work under an organization that makes the most out of their talents. Unfortunately, more and more, it seems that the structure of international broadcasting clips their wings. Legislation in the 1990s established the Broadcasting Board of Governors as an independent federal agency responsible for all U.S. non-military international broadcasting. Today, the BBG exercises authority over 5 distinct broadcasting services, managed by a bipartisan and a part-time presidentially appointed board of 9 individuals. The board is supposed to set the priorities and overall strategic direction of the U.S. international broadcasting. It's supposed to allocate the resources and safeguard journalistic integrity. But plagued by vacancies and infighting, the BBG has trouble accomplishing any of that. In January, the State Department Inspector General depicted an agency with a dedicated staff attempting to serve, in their words, a dysfunctional structure. The BBG's, quote, dysfunction stems from a flawed legislative structure and stems from acute internal dissension. The report concludes noting that a part-time board cannot effectively supervise operations. Indeed, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton testified before the committee, and we recall her words, that the BBG is, quote, practically a defunct agency in terms of its capacity to be able to tell a message around the world, unquote. She went on to regret that, in her words, we are abdicating the ideological arena. I agree with her assessment. The stakes are very high. As we speak, Governments around the world have stepped up efforts to influence opinion abroad and to stifle dissent back at home. In Pakistan, small local radio stations broadcast messages that promote extremism and incite violence against every other minority group in Pakistan. The fight against terrorism and other threats to our national security must include a fight against bad ideas. If done well, the payoff of broadcasting is tremendous. With an information war underway, U.S. international broadcasting must be as sharp as ever. We must relearn some of the techniques, and this includes the broadcast entities themselves. The former head of Radio Free Europe once summed up their mission this way, and quote, "Irritate authoritarian regimes, inspire Democrats, and create greater space for civil society," unquote. Our goal here is to figure out how to do more of just that, and I'll now turn to Ranking Member Engel for his opening remarks.
Chairman Royce, thank you for calling this very timely hearing on an issue that impacts millions of people around the world, which is U.S. international broadcasting. Last month, I had the opportunity to speak at the 70th anniversary of the Voice of America's Albanian service. That event was a reminder that providing unbiased views and news to those who are denied access to information in their own countries remains as relevant today as it was when VOA began broadcasting during World War II. U.S. international broadcasting endures because it has maintained a commitment to journalistic integrity. First principle of our broadcasting is to provide news that is, quote, consistently reliable and authoritative, accurate, objective, and comprehensive, end of quote. In the years since the dawn of U.S. international broadcasting, the structures and technologies to deliver the news have changed dramatically. What began as VOA Radio has evolved into 5 distinct organizations housed within the Broadcasting Board of Governors, or BBG. Today, these entities reach over 200 million people per week in 61 languages, radio, TV, the Internet, and even mobile phones. While the BBG and its various sub-entities continue to play an important role in U.S. foreign policy, some questions have been raised about the management of the agency. An Inspector General report issued earlier this year found that the BBG was, and I quote again, failing in its mandated duties, unquote, and it attributed that failure to a flawed structure and strong internal dissension. One problem highlighted by the report is that the BBG board, originally intended to operate on a part-time basis, has in practice assumed full-time responsibilities of supervising a massive media organization with broadcasts to more than 100 countries. This problem has been compounded by the large number of board vacancies, which has left the BBG without a quorum necessary to make official decisions. Currently, only 4 of the 9 board slots are filled. These vacancies increase the pressure and responsibilities of the sitting governors to supervise the BBG. I hope the Senate will soon take action on the 3 nominees now being considered, and that the President will nominate additional board members. In addition, questions have been raised about the lines of authority at the BBG. Voice of America, which is a federal entity, reports to the head of the International Broadcasting Bureau, while Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, a private grantee, reports directly to the Board of Governors. This can create confusion about who's in charge, resulting in unnecessary duplication and undermining accountability. Finally, many of us are concerned about the consistently low morale among employees at the BBG. Year after year, federal surveys show that the BBG ranks among the bottom of all federal agencies in terms of job satisfaction. In response to these and other issues, the administration has proposed the creation of a chief executive officer. The CEO would be selected by the board and be delegated will be delegated to some of the board's responsibilities, including the day-to-day management of the agency. This approach is supported by the Inspector General. As we examine ways to improve the governance of international broadcasting, it's vital that any reforms maintain the journalistic integrity that's been built over the last 70 years. This means maintaining a strong firewall between journalism and politics. I look forward to hearing a frank assessment from our witnesses on the challenges facing the BBG and on the board's proposal to create a CEO, as well as other recommendations they might have for improving U.S. international broadcasting. I'm a big supporter of VOA. I'm a big supporter of U.S. broadcasting. Congresswoman Ross Leighton and I, many years ago, had the fight for Radio Marti. I really think this makes a change. I've done a lot of work in Albania. And the interesting thing for me is when Albania first opened up, when I was here in the early 1990s, and I went there, I asked them what happened during the Cold War when you had the most repressive dictatorship. How did you know what was going on? And they said that the Voice of America was important. They all listened to it. They listened to some television from Italy. But Voice of America was instrumental, and I believe it was instrumental then, it was instrumental during the Cold War, and it's instrumental now. So as the VOA adage goes, tell the truth and let the world decide. I believe that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. We're going to go now to our witnesses. We've been joined by three who all previously served on the Broadcasting Board of Governors. The Honorable James Glassman served as Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs before he became Chairman of the Broadcasting Board of Governors from 2007 to 2008. Mr. Wimbush, Honorable Enders Wimbush, is the Executive Director for Strategy and Development at the National Bureau of Asian Research. He was a member of the board from 2010 to 2012, but he was also Director of Radio Free Liberty from 1987 to 1993 as the Iron Curtain fell. The Honorable D. Jeff Hirschberg, his 8-year tenure on the Broadcasting Board of Governors began in 2002. Before that, he worked at the Department of Justice, where he was Special Attorney to the Deputy Attorney General. So we welcome all three of you, and I'm going to ask you to summarize your opening statements, and without objection, the witnesses will have their full prepared statements made part of the record. Members have 5 days to submit your statements or additional questions. And Mr. Glassman, we'll begin with you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Engel, members of the committee, congratulations on this hearing. Now is the time to think big about reforming not just the BBG, but the entire public diplomacy effort of the U.S. government. Today, I want to make 4 points. First, this hearing's title refers to former Secretary Clinton's statement that the BBG is defunct. It is not. The BBG is one of the largest news-gathering operations in the world. Last week, it announced a total audience of more than 203 million, a new record. The Inspector General said in January, U.S. government broadcasting is characterized by journalism of the highest caliber. Second, while the BBG is alive and well, its mission is contradictory and confused. The law asks it both to be a tool of U.S. foreign policy and an independent, unbiased journalistic organization protected from government interference. In fact, the BBG's mission should be the same as that of the State Department itself, to achieve the specific strategic goals of U.S. national security and foreign policy. Good journalism is not the end, but the means. This is my most important message to you. You need to resolve the contradiction by law and clarify the mission. It's simply unfair to call the BBG defunct or even dysfunctional when Congress and the executive branch have not provided the BBG with a clear sense of what they want it to be and what they want it to do. Third, structure. The BBG must be fully integrated into the foreign policy apparatus of the U.S. government. The modern BBG was created in 1999 after the functions of the U.S. Information Agency were mostly folded into the State Department, and international broadcasting was consolidated as a separate body, the BBG. The best way to remove any confusion about the BBG's mission is to put it back into the State Department under an assistant secretary playing close to the CEO role that the current board and the administration envision, or as part of a resurrected USIA. It should have an advisory board composed of members with expertise in media technology and in disseminating ideas in general. High journalistic standards must be maintained for this new BBG. Propaganda simply does not work. All current broadcasting functions should be subsumed within the State Department, including those of the so-called grantees, such as Radio Free Europe. The distinction in functions among BBG entities has largely evaporated. At any rate, as a 2012 Hudson Institute report says, it should be made clear to the various broadcasting services that they are in the public sector and are part of the U.S. foreign policy team. This does not simply mean performing in a manner consistent with the broad foreign policy objectives of the United States, as the law states, but instead following actual strategic directives, for example, to convince the Pakistanis that they face an existential threat from al-Qaeda. Fourth, in examining the BBG, this committee should broaden its sights and encompass the government's soft power function as a whole. In her statement to this committee in January, Secretary Clinton focused on the BBG in describing her frustration, as you noted, Mr. Chairman, with America's failure to tell a message around the world. She said, "We're letting the jihadist narrative fill a void. We need to get in there and compete." That's true, but it is wrong to single out the BBG, which is only ambiguously part of the public diplomacy apparatus, for this failure. It's also disingenuous to point outward in assigning the blame when the responsibility to get in there and compete should lie within the State Department and the White House. When I was at State, we had a clear mandate from the White House, backed by support from the National Security Council, to wage a war of ideas, an informational and ideological struggle against the jihadist narrative to which Secretary Clinton refers. Now the term war of ideas has become anathema. The fact is, we will never thwart our enemies and win the world's respect if we don't stand up for our values and oppose the ideology of violent extremism, just as we addressed communism during the Cold War. What we need is what I call a strategic public diplomacy, that is, soft power directed to achieve specific national security aims with the full commitment of a President and Congress that understand that these nonviolent efforts are as important as warfare. My own interest in this area began in 2003 when I was appointed to the Advisory Group on Public Diplomacy for the Arab and Muslim World. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Glassman. Mr. Wimbush.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Mr. Engel, thank you for this opportunity. I also want to applaud the effort of this committee to take a good look at the BBG and its relationship to international broadcasting.
Mr. Wimbush, push the button on your microphone and pull it a little closer.
Is that better? We got it?
There you go.
There we go. I've spent a long time on both the front lines and the back lines of international broadcasting, so let me give you my assessment clearly and succinctly. The BBG was a bad idea when it was created, and it's dysfunctional today, with 5 of its 8 governors, including 3 of its 4 Republican members, and both its chairman and as a replacement, as well as the alternate presiding governor, having resigned in frustration or disgust. The BBG cannot now function legally as intended because it now lacks an operating quorum. The BBG, in my estimate, has failed to provide U.S. international broadcasting with effective strategic guidance, with good governance, with economic efficiency, or any credible link, as Governor Glassman has just said, to U.S. foreign policy goals and strategies, and these are built into the BBG system. The BBG is dysfunctional in 3 but overlapping in interrelated ways. First, it is, as Mr. Engel pointed out, a melange of different kinds of organizations, 3 federal agencies and 3 501c3s. They operate on totally different sets of laws, conventions, and practices. They cannot be made to work. The only thing they have in common is that they do media. Second, the BBG's governance model could hardly be worse or more debilitating. It has no real leadership. The chairman's role is more honorary than functional, and his powers are nowhere spelled out. Congress originally intended the Board of Governors to oversee but not to manage, but this has morphed into the BBG becoming a collective CEO, which has resulted in confused lines of responsibility and authority, oversight, and management. And the BBG is dysfunctional strategically, and this is the most important point. Our competitors have multiplied while our allies have retreated. One would think that American strategists would begin to sharpen their spears to compete in this world, yet the opposite seems to be happening, again, due in large part to the incoherence of the BBG. Let me illustrate with an example. Nearly every year, the BBG receives requests from concerned Igbo-speaking Nigerians to inaugurate a broadcast service in their language. Igbo spoken by 18 to 20% of the Nigerian population of 175 million, which means a media audience of somewhere between 30 to 35 million in an energy-rich, demographically young, geographically salient country. This would seem to be a no-brainer, but every year it's refused. And why is this? Because rampant duplication of effort across the 5 networks vastly reduces the funding opportunities for new ventures, however strategic. I'm confident that members of this board know that the Voice of America has a Russian broadcasting service, and you probably even know that Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty also have a Russian broadcasting service. But the Voice also has a Burmese broadcasting service, as does Radio Free Asia. Now, if this were the end of the list, we might find a reasonable explanation, but it's just the beginning. U.S. International Broadcasting now operates 2 language services on different networks in each of the following languages: Albanian, Bosnian, Macedonian, Serbian, Armenian, Azerbaijani, Georgian, Russian, Ukrainian, Uzbek, Arabic, Dari, Pashto, Persian, Burmese, Cantonese, Khmer, Korean, Lao, Mandarin, Tibetan, and Vietnamese. And the VOA and the Office of Cuba Broadcasting both broadcast in Spanish, too. If you're counting, that's 23 duplications. Now, advocates of duplication say it's necessary because they do different things. I've been hearing that canard since I ran Radio Liberty. There is no location for surrogate or non-surrogate broadcasting these days. Think about the new technologies. Think about crowdsourcing. Crowdsourcing, which is the gathering of information through mobile devices. It is the classic surrogate instrument. Are we going to tell the Voice of America that it can't be doing this? It uses it everywhere. We need to get rid of this distinction between surrogate and non-surrogate. My 4 conclusions. 1, get rid of the BBG as the organizing organization for U.S. international broadcasting. 2, separate oversight from management. 3, put one unified, full-time professional management in place with jurisdiction over all U.S. international broadcasting. 4, create conditions for strategic decision-making. And 5, abandon this simplistic distinction between telling America's story and surrogate broadcasting. There are ways to get there. I'd be happy to expand on those if asked. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Weisbush. We go now to Mr. Hirschberg.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Engel, members of the committee, thank you for holding the hearing. I share some of the things that my colleagues have said up here, and a lot of it I just flat don't. My experience on the broadcasting board, I think, is a little bit different. I served there for roughly 8.5 years, and during that period of time, we served for 2 years without a chairman because we were basically down to the final 4, as we called ourselves. And before that, the board actually did work collegially to really address major strategic issues and initiate certain services such as Al Hurra Television, which were much needed. There were no votes on that sort of thing. It was done by consensus. Democrats and Republicans agreed that it was needed, created a promotional video, took it into the White House. The President of the United States bought it, and we were up and running within 5 months of funding through the appropriations process. And we went on the air February 14th, Valentine's present, 2004. So the board actually can work if you have a first-rate chairman and 7 other people of goodwill who are willing to work together to accomplish the strategic goals of the BBG. Now, having said that, I understand that it looks like, to me at least, things have changed over the course of time, and now there's a a push for reform. The current board and my successor board put out a strategic plan, and the President has accepted part of that strategic plan. OMB has supported it, and they have offered up a CEO of U.S. International Broadcasting. While I may not believe it's necessary, I can support it. And I can support it as long as the CEO of U.S. International Broadcasting is beyond and behind the firewall, with the rest of the BBG board, must remain behind the firewall. The most important thing that U.S. International Broadcasting has in its favor around the world is its credibility. So my suggestion to you, and I urge you that when you are considering making certain changes, keep in mind that the most thing that we have going for us is our credibility. I don't think you get that by destroying the broadcast entities in any way, shape, or form. I don't believe you get that by putting VOA and the rest of the entities into the State Department. I'm not in favor of that. While there's so much to talk about, it's hard to know where to stop. I want to leave you with just one more thing before we answer questions. Assuming you get this 100% right, and the structure is 100% correct, and everybody's satisfied with whatever structure you come up with, it still only addresses half of the problem. The other half of the problem, after structure and whatever reforms you want to put into place, is that U.S. International Broadcasting is substantially underfunded to do what it needs to do. Just one example. If you look at Al Jazeera in the United States today, they're welcome here because we have a First Amendment. They are spending roughly $750 or $800 million to stand up a network in the United States alone. That's over 100% of U.S. International Broadcasting's worldwide budget. So my last thing that I want to share with you is that while there may be some need for reform in the Broadcasting Board of Governors itself, which I can support, the broadcast entities themselves are performing their jobs as well or better than they ever have, and quite frankly, Voice of America, MBN on one side, the surrogates on the other, are just two sides of the same coin. And what you're talking about in mission statements is merely matters of degree. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hirschberg. I do think it's, as we look at this issue, there isn't any question, but that during the Cold War, we were particularly effective during a period of time. I remember I was in East Germany for a while and saw the impact of these broadcasts and saw how you did them wrong and how you did them right. The old bombastic West German broadcasts, people weren't interested in that. But when we recruited East German stringers and began to put those young reporters on the line, people were fixated on on what they had to hear. Over the years, we, I think, learned certain lessons. The State Department wanted us out of Yugoslavia on the broadcasting. I remember a young Croatian with tears in his eyes telling me that the hate radio dominated all over the former Yugoslavia, and that was one of the reasons, the fact that we had never really had effective broadcasting in there. I had legislation to try to do that, and I believe we finally got that through, and it got it up and running the day before we started bombing. I think it's very clear over the years that also the concept of a mission of trying to offset the totalitarian and especially the hate broadcasts that are done in these societies. We tried to, far prior to 9/11, and we tried to get broadcasting up and running, the right type of broadcasting in Afghanistan. I remember that struggle. I carried that legislation. Again, we didn't get that through until after the attack and after the death of the leader of the Northern Alliance. And I think that as we go forward, clearly we have to learn from what we did right. And that's why Mr. Wimbush's testimony is of tremendous interest to me, because during his tenure, we did something right. And it wasn't partisan. It was a nonpartisan effort to try to disseminate the facts about what was actually happening in that part of the world. Mr. Wimbush, would you like to extrapolate a little more? Because when you finished your testimony, you said if we wanted to hear more from you about specifics, you'd be happy to give us those specifics.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, like Jeff Hirschberg, I am not a big fan of putting it all within the State Department. It's one model, and I think you need to look at a number of different models. But I really think that this committee needs to hit for the fence. I think it needs to entertain a number of pathways to the goal you want, but for me, the one that stands out is far and away the most logical, and coincidentally the one that will lead inevitably to the fewest instances of backsliding into the current BBG dilemma, is to create one standalone media organization incorporating all of these existing media enterprises. Now, it puts a big load on your plate because that means defederalizing the Voice of America and the Office of Cuba Broadcasting. Frankly, this to me is far and away the best outcome that you could come up with. There are other models that you could look at that might put the Voice of America off by itself, and maybe it goes into state or stands alone, and the Radio Frees, the grantees, go in something else. What I would not do is organize in a way that enhances this distinction between telling America's story and doing surrogate broadcasting. When I was the director of Radio Liberty, one of the most important programs we put on the air, and I resisted it because a member of the BIB at that time told me he wanted something that told America's story. We put on a program from our New York office called Broadway 1776. It followed new emigres from Russia around the streets of New York, into the PTA, into the stores, into the intellectual institutions, into the museums. It was the most fantastic piece of surrogate broadcasting because it was about them, and it was one of the finest and most wonderful examples of telling America's story because it told how the whole thing worked. But look, in contrast, here is an announcement from the Voice of America, which is not supposed to be a surrogate station, although it's been practicing surrogacy for a long time. This is how they describe their new offering to South Sudan just 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I quote, "With South Sudan in focus as its flagship program, the English language service will offer news for South Sudan, about South Sudan, and by South Sudan reporters. That is, for the country, about the country, by the country people." It's simply impossible to get more surrogate than that. So the objective, your objective, I think, should be to create as many possible synergies as you can without creating these firewalls, these barriers for the sharing of information, the creating of new images and messages, and the healthy functioning of the whole media organization as a single entity.
Any further suggestions, as long as you're here as a witness?
I will, in my written testimony, you'll see that I make a number of suggestions, but I would defer to my colleagues at this point.
Mr. Hirschberg.
I believe in taking on fights so that you can have a chance of winning.
Mr. Hirschberg.
Sorry,
take
is it
the,
there? There you
yes.
are. For the 8.5 years that I was on the board, we sort of took on fights that we thought we could win. Defederalizing VOA and OCB had been considered by the previous board for a number of years, and at that point in time, we decided we could not do it. And so therefore, we chose to do other things in our discretion. I'm not for a single, necessarily broadcast entity. I think that the surrogates and VOA and MBN, on the other hand, do a very good job the way they are. I think there's a lot of things that can be done with respect to synergizing what they do. I think there's a lot of things that can be done vis-a-vis a management structure, and you could actually consolidate back office operations, consolidate IT. consolidate other things, that certainly can be done. Now, if you want to do that and create an entire broadcast of a single broadcast entity, that's your privilege. You can change the legislation to do that if that's what you want to do. I just don't see a need for it.
Well, you did speak about resources,
I certainly
and our resources aren't infinite.
correct.
So the concept of merging the two, as Mr. Wimbush articulates, might not only lead to the added efficiencies, but might lead to the ability to do more programming effectively. As he ticks off the different dialects and languages that we do the broadcasting in, and there's probably 170, I would guess, or so, at least around the world. The reality is that there's a certain duplication there. So clearly, if you can consolidate that, you might, especially given the fact that you do have a lot of information around the world in terms of straight news. This is a little different mission, and consolidating that with the personnel that have those abilities in that niche to speak to those audiences and having them in the same operation might be tremendously more efficient. I don't know.
It may be more efficient, Mr. Chairman, but in the meantime, the GAO report on this did not go far enough to analyze duplicated versus unduplicated audiences, who listens to which of those services, what the effect of those services is, how they, what their audience reach is, what their credibility is. If you want to go to that step and then make the judgment as to whether or not the language services ought to be eliminated one way or another, that's just fine.
Well, I'm out of time. I'll go to Mr. Engel. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask all three of you broad-based questions based on your written testimony, which I've read, and what you've said. All three of you had different views on what the fundamental mission on U.S. international broadcasting should or should not be. And correct me if I'm wrong. Mr. Hirschberg, you said that our broadcasters don't do advocacy work. Mr. Wimbush, you believe the differentiation in missions between surrogates and telling America's story is no longer relevant. And Mr. Glassman, you testified that the entity should be brought in line with U.S. strategic directives. So these all seem to be quite different opinions. So let me just throw it out and say, amongst the three of you, is there any common ground on the overarching mission of U.S. international broadcasting? Is it possible for broadcasters to provide authoritative, accurate, and objective news while at the same time advancing U.S. interests? Any one of you care to?
Well, I'll be happy to take the first crack at that. The mission, Mr. Engel, the mission of international broadcasting is to support U.S. foreign policy. I mean, I don't think anybody disagrees with that. Today, the connective tissue between what the BBG does and the programs that its networks create and the overall aims of U.S. foreign policy is almost non-existent. I think Jim Glassman mentioned that in his testimony. Somehow, that has to be revivified. It has to be made a clearer, more concise connection. And Jeff Hirschberg is also right that this has to be done within the context of good journalism. I think of it as journalism with an edge, but it's journalism. We have a reason for doing it. It's to support U.S. foreign policy and U.S. foreign policy objectives, to support human rights, to advance freedom and enterprise, all of those things. But it has to be done within the context of good journalism. Without that, and we learned at Radio Liberty during the Cold War, without the credibility that comes with good journalistic practice, you're blown out of the water almost immediately. Everyone can smell a bad story. And today, if you drive through any village in the Middle East or Turkey or Asia, and you look up at an apartment building and you see the satellite dishes, sometimes 2 or 3 to a balcony, you understand that these people are not suffering from the regime's monopoly on information. They're receiving 200 to 400 channels of something. So credibility and context for U.S. international broadcasting is utterly critical. In this explosion of media, people are asking more and more and more, all right, we got the facts or what we think are the facts, but what does it mean? That's U.S. broadcasting's niche.
Mr. Engel, as I said in my testimony, the mission of the BBG should be to help achieve the specific strategic goals of U.S. foreign policy. That's just not true today. It is true that the BBG, in many instances, most recently, for example, in the Sahel, where they're working with the DOD and state to increase broadcasting, or in Somalia, in many cases, they are working toward these strategic aims. But that is not the main function or the main mission of the BBG today. And that's why I worry when Mr. Wimbush, with whom I agree on a lot of the things he said, talks about the BBG standing alone. It shouldn't stand alone. It should be part of the foreign policy apparatus. The reason that things worked during the Cold War was the entire U.S. government was mobilized in its soft power elements to fight communism, and we did a great job. That's not true with our soft power today, at a time when I believe the problem is as urgent as it was then.
Mr. Engel, let me answer it this way. It's not that the BBG is devoid of conversations with the State Department. That's not true. The BBG constantly sets its broadcast priorities in conjunction with the formal consultation with the State Department once a year during the BBG language service process, and indeed it is more iterative than that over the course of years. So yes, we talk to the State Department. Yes, we have a mandate to coordinate how and where we broadcast with U.S. strategic goals. And the BBG actually does just that.
Could I just add, Jeff?
Yeah.
I'll never forget when I joined the BBG as chairman, our first consultation with the State Department. We go over to the State Department, and there's the deputy, and we sit down with him, and he talks to us for a half an hour, and he said, well, okay, Iran is a priority this year, Turkey's not a priority, just kind of listed things. That was the level of consultation we had with the State Department. I'm proud to say that because I later became Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, we had more of a tie. But really, these conversations are not a kind of serious strategic coordination with the State Department or the Defense Department or otherwise, although more of it is now going on.
Thank you.
If we could go to Mr. Rohrbacher.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. I remember quite well when you came to, I'll make sure the chairman hears this. Mr. Chairman, I remember quite well when you came to Congress. I'm going to get the chairman's attention here.
Yes, Mr. Rohrbacher.
I'm just reminding the witnesses that when you came to Congress, Radio Free Asia was your baby. And the chairman put an enormous amount of work in for a new member of Congress to actually get a whole new system set up, passed through Congress and in place was quite an achievement. And what we're saying today is that we can't just start things, let them go, and a good idea can sort of go astray unless we keep a good grip on the direction and have good oversight. What we're hearing today is that there has been a breakdown in accountability across the board in America's broadcasting capabilities and in terms of our government's operations anyway. And I think it's, look, I've had some experience on this as well. I was very concerned last year when the president of Radio Free Asia, for example, fired the head of the Tibetan service. And here I am, a senior member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I tried to find out information about this. I was told by the RFA that they didn't have any responsibility toward Congress, that they were independent. Well, let's see, the federal government's paying for it, and the elected representatives of the people who are trying to oversee how money's being spent don't have any rights to information about decisions made within the organization. Something's wrong there. And what you're telling me today is that that type of oversight is broken down for the entire, in terms of the broadcasting board is not functioning, much less functioning in our behalf. So we've got some work to do, Mr. Chairman, to follow up on the work you started a number of years ago. We heard a suggestion today that we might be folding all of these surrogate efforts, stopping the duplication by folding in all of the surrogate units into the Voice of America. Is that something that can work? And if so, how do we start that process? Mr. Wimbush, you may go forward on that.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. I am not advocating folding everything into the Voice of America. What I am advocating is creating a new organization that contains all of the language services that currently exist, minus their duplicates. We simply can't do broadcasting in Igbo or a dozen other strategic languages for us today that were not strategic a decade ago, because we have 2 language services that broadcast to Armenia, population minus.
Okay, well, I got it, but so you're not advocating that we fold them back into the Voice of America, but we have one system, so are you then advocating we eliminate the Voice of America?
No, I'm not advocating that either. I'm advocating creating an organization where you have enough flexibility. You can keep the brands within the organization because the brands have value. Think of those of you who want to think about it, think of the NPR model. The following program is brought to you by Public Radio International. The following program is brought to you by America Abroad Media. There's absolutely no reason that we can't operate that way. Okay. But we need, within the organization, the flexibility to direct resources where it is strategically valuable at any given time and over the long period, to eliminate duplication and to make sure that we get the balance between surrogate and non-surrogate rights.
We also, and I would add to that, that we do need to eliminate the duplication, and we also need to make sure that whatever we set up has accountability, and that and we have a breakdown in accountability in this system right now. Let me just note we were compared to Al Jazeera. Look, Al Jazeera is financed by massive oil or massive gas assets of the state of Qatar, and we can't even build a pipeline here, much less finance new things based on energy. How much do we spend totally on broadcasting? Do we know that anywhere?
The total budget?
Total budget for broadcasting with all the surrogates, et cetera.
When I joined the board in 2010, it was about $765 million. Today, it's with all the various cuts and things, I think we're down around 730. But
that's with the duplicates.
That's everybody. That's the Voice and the surrogates.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I think in terms of languages, there's probably about 43 and over at VOA, and we're probably duplicating most of that. So, 80-some, if you look at it from the standpoint of the duplication. Mr. Sherman.
We don't broadcast in Japanese or German because those are countries of the free press, so they get plenty of good information at their own cost. What strategic interest are we achieving by broadcasting both television and radio in Greek? Anybody have an insight, Mr. Glassman?
None.
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 Good. There's this idea of putting the broadcasters in state. There was a big political wrangle over the Benghazi talking points, but it illustrated one thing that I've come to know all too well, and that is it takes 20 drafts to get a few paragraphs out of the State Department, and by the time the process is done, most of the content has been leached out. Imagine trying to run a radio service in which every broadcast has to be cleared by several different bureaus. We need to maintain enough distinction between the State Department and the broadcasters so that every news report isn't considered an official statement of the U.S. government, subject to 17 reviews. I think we need one agency overseeing this to avoid the duplication. We can't afford to have 6 different duplicative approaches, although if we had unlimited money, I'd be for it. We need somebody, a chief executive running this. I don't care whether he or she reports to a board or an undersecretary. We've had some, Mr. Rohrbacher, who's just left, pointed out how there's a lack of accountability to Congress, which is quite distinct. I've spent the last 2 years trying to get broadcasts in the Sindh language. Are any of you aware of a country more important than the world's only somewhat unstable nuclear power? I don't see anybody responding because there is no response. You've got a large percentage of Pakistan that speaks in the Sindhi language. We're not broadcasting even in radio, but we're doing Greek television and radio, both. You gentlemen have been on the inside. What is the attitude of the bureaucracy and the boards to ideas from Congress? Is it actual, not invented here hostility, or just total disinterest? Mr. Hirschberg.
Neither one of those. Right. Neither one of those.
I've been here 17 years. I haven't seen any suggestion taken by the broadcasters unless it was passed by both houses of Congress and binding on them in law. But Mr. Glassman, do you have a different view?
Well, I think you brought up Greek. I think one of the reasons that Greek continues to be broadcast is because there are members of Congress who insist upon it. I can only speak for my tenure as chairman, and when Jeff Hirschberg was on the board, we had a terrific board and a really committed board. I think we paid a lot of attention to Congress. I know I did, and I think certainly Mr. Hirschberg did. That's where our money comes from. That's where there's a lot of brain power that's helpful to us. So I really think there's a...
I'm more familiar with Mr. Rohrbacher's experience where you ask for information and you're just told, well, if you can get an act of Congress passed through both houses compelling us to give you the information, then we'll give it to you. Mr. Hirschberg, do you have a different view?
That just wasn't our attitude when I was on the board. It was just not, it just did not work that way.
Well,
Congress always talked to us about, and different members, about what their desires would be.
This committee...
And when we sent up a reprogramming notice, which was $750,000 or more, Congress got to say yes or no in whole or in part to anything we wanted to do.
If I can reclaim my time, this committee 2 years ago passed an amendment to broadcast in the Sindh language. No steps have been taken to do that, even to do it on the internet by any of the broadcasters. I'm sure that if we had enacted a State Department authorization bill through the entire process and had made it almost a criminal offense not to follow the law, then they would have followed it. But a mere vote of this committee got no response. Do any of you have any ideas on how I can get broadcasting in the Sindhi language?
Yes. You can cut some of the duplicate broadcasts that currently go out so that there's money to do it. I mean, we're talking about finite dollars here.
Amen. Thank you, and my time has expired.
Very easy to do.
Thank you very much. The chair will now recognize herself for 5 minutes. The mission of the Board of Broadcasting Board of Governors is to inform, to engage, to connect people around the world in support of freedom and democracy. And when analyzing the effectiveness of BBG programs, we must do so through the prism of those founding principles that are essential to fulfilling the mission of the Broadcasting Board of Governors. However, we must also be aware that BBG is created and operated in many closed societies where they have dictatorial rule with marginal resources, so I understand that it's not a perfect system, but I do believe strongly that the mission of the BBG is vital to advance U.S. Foreign policy objectives, to promote democratic principles, and be a resource to those living under these repressive authoritarian regimes. And I have seen the success of BBG programs firsthand with Radio and TV Marti. In '83, as we know, President Reagan signed the Radio Broadcast to Cuba Act, and when commemorating this event, President Reagan commented that this action will finally let the Cuban people hear the truth from the outside world. Through Radio and TV Marti, we have been able to publicize and showcase to the world the atrocities that occur in Cuba, and the people know their voices are being heard and that they are not alone, because the United States will stand by them in their struggle for freedom. However, serious problems continue to occur in Radio and TV Marti. Programming needs to improve. The transmission interference remains a major obstacle to getting the signal into all parts of the island. It's good in some areas, not good in others. Radio is good overall, but TV continues to get jammed because we have not modernized the way that we transmit that signal and have not been operating in the way that we should, so that we can expand access of this broadcast throughout the island. So one of my first questions when I finish is, what are we doing to improve the transmission into Cuba of the TV Marti signal so that everyone can receive it, understanding that Castro will, of course, do everything within his power to jam it and to block it. And staying in the Western Hemisphere, I'm concerned that countries such as Venezuela and Ecuador continue to crack down and suppress independent journalists. I believe this gives BBG an excellent opportunity to strongly support civil society and journalists who are trying to use the media to get the word out. In Venezuela, that's practically unheard of. In Ecuador, with the new media law that they have adopted, ironically enough, in the same week that Snowden writes a letter to Correa, the president of Ecuador, seeking asylum, and he's seeking asylum in the very country that does everything to suppress press freedom. But that's a fight for another day. So do you think that VOA Latin America can fill the vacuum in these countries that have shut down independent media, and that VOA can be a resource there? And we've seen instances that BBG has been unable to live up to its objectives and has greatly underperformed in its role to promote democratic reforms. In the hearing that I held just last week in Middle East and North Africa about the election results in Iran, one of our witnesses talked about the inadequacies of VOA's Persian News Network. So if we could start with, I think we'll just have time for Radio and TV Marti.
I'd be delighted, Madam Chairman. I happen to be one of the big fans of Radio Marti for the very simple reason that Cuba is in a major transition, and sometime in the near future, it's going to pop back into its hemisphere, and it's going to be a major player. It is very much in America's strategic interest to shape that transition and to aid it any way we possibly can.
How can we fix the transmission problem so that the signal gets to the people?
This is something I can't answer. This is an engineering question. But if resources are available, I'm sure that a way to do it can be found.
Gentlemen?
And Madam Chair, I would just add that I understand, just from a press release, that the BBG is using other means to get into Cuba. For example, I've never heard of this before, but paper thumb drives that have recordings from radio and TV Marti transmissions. I think this is a great idea, and it's a good example of how the BBG should work more broadly.
And Giovanni Sanchez, the blogger, has been very active in trying to get more people to come in with those. Thank you very much. My time is up.
Madam Chairman, I would
Yes.
ask unanimous consent that the panel be able to respond to the chairwoman's thoughtful
Well,
questions
thank you.
in such time as may be required.
Wow, thank you very much. So then I had asked about Venezuela and Ecuador just as examples of countries that have clamped down severely on press freedoms. Do you see an expanding role of VOA there?
Yes, the current board, in fact, has made a real effort to expand its role into Latin America. I'm a year away from the board, so I'm not exactly sure where they're going. But the board's strategy director, Bruce Sherman, who came from Radio Marti and speaks fluent Spanish, identified almost immediately a 24/7 satellite that could be used.
That's great.
The concept we tried to put in place, which comes right to your point about how do we influence Latin America, would be to use this wonderful facility in Miami, which is also the home of Latin American banking, Latin American media, use that as the hub for Latin America work, and put Marti at the center of it rather than on the periphery. And use
Thank you.
that.
And then the last question was on the inadequacies of our VOA Persian News Network, so that even when the president was addressing the Iranian people, he opted to use BBC Persian because the VOA Persian News Network was not transmitting in the way that it should. What can we do for that?
Well, I'm happy to address that. When I joined the board in 2010, the very first effort I made was to analyze the Persian News Network, and I produced a fairly extensive report on it. The Persian News Network can produce some startlingly good programming and some startlingly bad programming. The problem is it's going to be extremely difficult to fix within the VOA structure because of the employment laws and all of the conventions that go along with being part of a federal agency. It was not put together correctly in the beginning, and now they're paying the price because it's going to be very hard to change.
Thank you, gentlemen. And now I'd like to turn to Mr. Connolly. He's such a charmer for all the time he wants.
Sorry there, Mr. Yoho. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, who is my friend. And welcome. Stepping back just a little bit, you all served on the board. We have an IG report that says that the BBG is failing in its mandated duties, and that failure came from a flawed legislative structure and strong internal dissension. Do you agree with those findings?
Yes.
I would not agree with those findings if they were made about the board on which I served. I think the board on which I served had the mission problem which I described, but we had dedicated, committed members who showed up, who devoted tremendous amounts of their time, and Jeff Hirschberg's a good example, traveled a great deal, minding the store at Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. So I don't think that's true. Now, part of the problem is that this board has not had a chair for a year and a half, and whether the chair has stipulated powers by law or not, you got to have a leader, and there are numerous vacancies. There
point.
are apparently, according to the OIG
And
report,
I'm not sure the IG report was necessarily, Mr. Glassman, laying the blame at the BBG board. I think it was talking about the whole structure, and it was also, frankly, holding us accountable for inadequate or maybe inappropriate legislative structure, which I want to come back to. Mr. Hirschberg.
Well, if you want to change the legislative structure, you're more than welcome to do it. If I didn't think there was anything the matter really with the BBG structure to begin with, and still don't.
Okay.
All right. Two, vis-a-vis the IG's report, I can't speak to that. That's a current board issue, and I'm not going to be critical of my successors in any way. There's enough people that are doing that now.
Well, okay, let's step back. Listening to your testimony, looking at the IG report, looking at a GAO report, we have a lot of duplication. We have a lot of redundancy. We're in an era of contracting resources, not expanding resources, including for diplomacy. Is this not a time to restructure BBG, streamline it? I mean, you know, you all concurred with Mr. Sherman's question that we are still broadcasting in Greek, but we're not broadcasting in Sindhi.
Right. And
that seems to be a misplaced priority. Mr. Glassman.
Yes, sir. And I think that's true. I wouldn't get carried away with the duplication issue. I think it's more a strategy issue. Someone needs to make a decision. If you've got $720 million to spend, or whatever the number is, what are the important places that we should put our resources?
Well, let me interrupt you. The GAO report says 2/3 of the BBG's language services overlap with some other language service.
Right.
That's a big overlap. It identified 23 instances of overlap involving 43 of BBG's 69 services.
Right, Congressman. However, that doesn't mean that they're all saying the same words at the same time. You know, NBC has MSNBC, CNBC, NBC, the Golf Channel. They're trying to achieve different kinds of things. I'm not saying there's not overlap. What I'm saying is that there's a bigger problem here, which is a strategic problem.
A fair point. And sometimes overlap may actually be a good thing.
Right.
Certainly as somebody in the political profession, I have learned repeat, and repeat again if you want to penetrate consciousness, especially in today's diffuse media market.
Right.
So there could be a reason for that.
I see nothing wrong with having, if Iran is an important target of American strategy,
Fair point.
I see nothing wrong with having Radio Farda, Persian News Network, VOA radio beamed into Iran. I wouldn't mind having actually several other stations, including an entertainment station, beamed into Iran.
Right.
But not into Greece, not into Turkey, not into some of the other places.
Fair enough. Mr.
Mr. Congressman, I agree entirely with Jim Glassman on getting strategic. We simply don't have the flexibility within the board structure as it exists to get the right program to the right audience on the right platform. We don't have it, and I will back that up with the proof. All of the duplication which you see today, virtually all of it, existed in 1998 when the board was created, 1994, 1998. Not a single board has dealt with this in any systematic, any reformist fashion. I can't conclude anything but that the structure of the board has to relate to that failure.
Mr. Hirschberg?
I always found that in a time of declining resources, the biggest problem that the Broadcasting Board and its entities have, there are too many language services chasing scarce dollars. So I'm for helping the board and helping the broadcast entities reprioritize some of this, because you can't be all things to all people. And even when we tried over the course of time, by the way, to cut some services from our broadcast entities, including some that were overlapping, you know, we had Congress said no to us. And in another case that I can recall very well, when we didn't even ask for a service, Congress mandated it. All right, now that's your perfect right, but nonetheless, I don't see that as necessarily a fault of BBG management.
Yeah, and I want to repeat, the IG report said that some of the fault lies here with the legislative structures we have created, which I think confirms the point you're making. And we have to take responsibility for our own actions or lack thereof. But let me end, I don't want to abuse the unlimited time I have. My colleagues are waiting. But could I just ask your thoughts about, okay, let's take that legislative structure concept. if we were starting over again, if we were to look at legislative reform, taking cognizance of the changed world and contracting resources, what would you recommend Congress consider doing, Mr. Glassman?
Integrating the BBG into the overall foreign policy structure. You know, 10 years ago, I was on the Dirigian group, which looked at public diplomacy in the Arab and Muslim world, and we concluded this. Broadcasting represents nearly half the spending on public diplomacy. It must be part of the public diplomacy process, not marching to its own drummer with its own goals and strategies, sources of funding, and board. And that was true 10 years ago. It's true today. How you structure it, there are many different ways to do it. You could put it into the State Department. You could resurrect USIA. You could have it as a as a separate entity, as Mr. Wimbush wants, as it is today, but directly reporting to somebody and responsible for someone who's in the foreign policy apparatus.
I was very struck by your testimony when you used the phrase strategic drift, and you told that story about the strategy session with the undersecretary or deputy secretary. It's an amazing story, actually, when you think about it. Mr. Wimbush.
Yeah, Mr. Conley, I don't want to leave the impression that I think that U.S. international broadcasting should report to no one. I just don't think it should report to the State Department. The challenge for this committee is going to be how to create the logical foreign policy anchor for international broadcasting within the foreign policy security community. My own view is this should be the National Security Council, but you have to figure out what that connective tissue looks like. Your question, if you're going to start over, what would you do? It's a no-brainer. If you were going to start over, you'd create one organization. And I urge you to start over.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Would we allow Mr. Hirschberg
Yes,
to answer,
absolutely.
and then I'm done. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay.
I don't share Mr. Glassman's view of having this go to the State Department. I don't share Ender's view of having it go to the NSC, having reporting go to the NSC. I do share, but I do believe that you should have an independent agency and entity, no matter what you call it. And if you have to rebrand something, which is clearly needed here, it ought to be rebranded. The BBG really needs to be rebranded. But I think that there's enough connectivity to our strategic interests as a country now. If you want to change that legislatively, you can always do it. But I don't share the view that somehow this is broken, somehow it's not part of the foreign policy community. Its goals are a little different, its objectives are a little different, but they're complementary to everything else. And if someone wanted to move the needle, all these other programs in the State Department and all the rest of them haven't done much. Why add VOA to it?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And
Thank you.
I owe you more chocolate.
Hey, thank you. Dr. Yoho is recognized. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you guys for being here today. And I'd like to thank you all for being here today. I have a healthy respect for the history of the Voice of America's related programs from World War II to the fall of communism. You can't help but feel nostalgic about these programs, and I commend that whole service. However, in today's fiscal and technological climate, I want to make sure that we're maximizing the use of the hardworking Americans' tax dollars and ensuring that we aren't subsidizing the broadcasting of policies that are counter to our goals. And I have a few questions related to that. And you're talking about we lack funding, and that would be one of the big things that help you. But yet in 2011, there was a study commissioned by BBG by Deloitte, and they recommended the consolidation of the administrative elements of the surrogate broadcast services, RFE, RL, RFA, and MBN. And the proposal noted that that would save anywhere from $9 to $14 million a year, but yet it hasn't been done the way I understand it. When you commission a study, obviously that costs money, and then you get the recommendations, and we don't follow through, and then we want more money. It seems like we would follow through on that. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. And then what kind of assessments are made of the listenerships? Is there an audience for these programs? Obviously, we're broadcasting in Greece, but not in the other areas where we need to be in the Arab world. And I understand the communication tools like the internet, et cetera, that we're granted, that we take for granted here, but may not be the most free and open in these other countries, hence the need for radio broadcasts. Has there been a recalibration of your distribution that takes into account newer, cheaper communication methods? And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Dr. Yoho, a couple of thoughts. Yes, on the board that I participated in, a study was done to look at consolidating the grantees, the radio frees, so to speak. To me, it was pretty conclusive. It makes not a whole lot of sense, in my view, to have Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, MBN, Radio Free Asia, all with their own HR departments, their own communications departments, their own newsrooms. I mean, this is just rampant duplication that should have been fixed a long time ago.
Why hasn't that been followed up on?
It was killed by the board itself.
Okay.
Within the board, there was a majority in favor of it. It was killed and delayed by one or two of the members.
Congressman, could I comment on your question about research? The BBG does an excellent job of audience research in some really tough places. However, and this gets to the strategic question that I've been emphasizing, the real question is, what are you doing with these audiences? What's the point? Is it just to gather a big group of people, or is it to do something with them? And it's my belief that it's to do something with them, which is to say, to persuade them. And there's not a lot of research on that. It's not easy to do, for one thing, but I also don't see it as the major mission of the BBG. And I think the mission needs to change, then the research should follow.
And you say that comes from the State Department on policy, because if we look in the Arab world right now with the Arab Spring, and we've got a whole different dynamic over there. You know, in the old days when you had Mubarak, you could kind of, I don't want to say predict, but you could predict how people were going to respond. But today it's a whole different message, and you know, your research should be tailored, I would think, to reaching that younger crowd and getting that message out. And you know, I know it goes back to Mr. Hirschberg saying money, and I know that's one of the big problems up here is money, money, money. So we've got to be super efficient at everything we do. One of the things that you guys touched about was, why isn't there more cohesion between the mission and our policy to help stimulate what you were talking about, the target population? Where is that being prevented? Is it in the management of the BBG, or is it coming from the State Department, or is it coming from us, the lack of that cohesion?
It's not part of the culture of the BBG, except in certain instances, and I commend the BBG for that. And I mentioned the Sahel, and there are several others where they are cooperating very well with state and with DOD. But overall, the BBG does not see it as its mission. Let me just use one example. It seems to me that it's in the national interest to persuade Iranians to oppose the development and deployment of nuclear weapons. We've got a lot of lines into Iran as a result of our BBG broadcasting. And yet, no one is directing the BBG, and I think the BBG, under the current system, would be quite reticent to go along with a directive from the State Department or the NSC or elsewhere to try to persuade Iranians. But I think that's actually what should be done.
Okay,
Well,
thank you.
if you do that, then
Madam Chair, can I have?
Absolutely.
Thank you, ma'am.
if you do that, then you better change the mission of the BBG. And you better change the...
That's what I've said.
Just let me finish, Jim. And you have to change, I know you do, and let's change the legislative intent and the legislative scheme. Because right now, the BBG does not do messaging, okay? Does not do advocacy. It is a pure journalistic mission. Hard truth and information will show people what a democratic society is all about. And vis-a-vis the research question, at least for the years that I was on the board, every service, every language service, every change in language service, every change in programming was heavily research-driven. There's a first-rate research department within the BBG. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Doctor. The two points that you raised. The first is, I think one should be very cautious about using numbers as an indication of the success of these services. You can get 200 million or 250 million But if it's the wrong 200 or wrong 250 million, you haven't really accomplished anything. One of the things that U.S. international broadcasting must do is to develop other measures of effectiveness, as they'd say in the military. We have to know how to measure impact much better. And that gets back to Jim's point about getting more strategic in how we're getting there. As to funding, Jim is absolutely right. It's not in the culture of the BBG to be strategic, to make these kinds of decisions. But there is a huge institutional impediment. When you begin your budget process every year, and you've got all of these duplicate services, and you know that if you start putting them out of business, you're going to have all kinds of people running to their congressman claiming that, you know, Armenian Service Number 2 has just been put out of business, or this is going to cause human resource problems of massive proportions. You fund them. You continue them. And that's got to stop.
It's got to stop, and it comes looks from the top down as a strong, clear mission statement of what we're trying to accomplish. I appreciate your time, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yoho. And now we will turn to another doctor, Dr. Barra. Doctor.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. It's a fascinating hearing here. Information absolutely is critical to getting our message out. It is absolutely critical to our diplomatic strategy, to our security strategy, and so forth. And I think the BBG's mission is pretty well stated. It's to promote freedom and democracy. Now, the BBG is not running a commercial enterprise. It's not about increasing your target audience. It's about getting a message out. And that is mission critical. You know, I've heard folks talk about effective boards, but I've not heard anyone say that the BBG is functioning in an effective manner today. And if we don't get that component together where we have a streamlined decision-making process, where we're making strategic decisions in conjunction with our diplomatic corps, in conjunction with our DOD, in conjunction with our security apparatus, I think we're missing a key element. You know, let me cite a specific example. The Congress, or the chairwoman, myself, and a few others were in Afghanistan recently visiting with our troops. The primary mechanism of getting information to the population of Afghanistan is radio. If we are not strategically communicating a message to these populations, we're going to be in a very difficult position to hold on to our gains. I would challenge that it is critical to our mission in a very strategic way where the state, where DOD, where our security apparatus are all working in conjunction to put a message out there to the public. It is a very effective way. We've seen how information's been used against us by jihadists, by Al-Qaeda and others. My question is, without, you know, we're all in agreement that it is not functioning in an effective way today. We need to move forward in this because if we lose the information battle, it is going to be very difficult. Concrete suggestions on what the makeup and mission of the board should be. Should we keep the board in its current structure? And, you know, again, concrete recommendations to this body on what we should do to create a much more effective organization. Mr. Glassman.
Well, I think, first of all, that a board of part-time advisors is a good idea, anyway, with whatever structure you want to have. But there needs to be somebody who's a leader, who's a CEO. Now, the real question, I think, is where do you put this agency? And we were just talking about that. I do, if you don't mind, I do want to comment on this, the strategic matter that you talked about. One of the very first things that happened to me when I was at the BBG was the head of counterterrorism at the State Department took me aside and said, you know, we'd really like you to broadcast 2 hours to Somalia instead of 1. And I said, well, it sounds like a good idea for me. But to me, I've got to convince the board, do you have the money? They did have the money. Point is, I could have said to him, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to spend the money on Greece, or we're going to spend the money somewhere else. It was a purely voluntary participation in U.S. strategy. That is what needs to end.
Therein lies the challenge.
Mr. Barra, a couple of things. I agree with Jeff. I'm not a fan of messaging per se. I am a fan of strategic focus, which is where Jim has put the emphasis. When you run one of these stations, as I have done, you learn very quickly that there are a lot of ways to get the right message or messages into a target area. During the Cold War, the Radio Liberty Russian service, which was arguably one of the finest services ever created, had as one of its most potent programs film reviews that made all the points that one wanted to get into this audience. So I think that where you're located is important, and how you connect it to the foreign policy apparatus is important. There has to be congressional input, a lot of it, but I don't think it should go much beyond. I think that should be broad recommendations. Our general foreign policy goals this year are to look at the following areas. Please put special emphasis on those. And then you have to do a lot of experimenting. There's no bureau, any place in the United States that can write you messages that will work. It just won't work.
Actually, I share a lot of what both of these gentlemen have said. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, for instance, in Russia, after Dave Brubeck went there, had a jazz program that was the most popular program in the Soviet Union at the time, and Russia afterwards. You can put a CEO of U.S. International Broadcasting into this mix. I mean, that's what the board wants. That's what the administration has said that they support. And I can support that as long as there is a BBG still in place of private citizens of diverse backgrounds that can act as a firewall and provide some strategic overall help to the board. And I think with those things, on the back office stuff, I'm all for consolidation, all right? But I don't think it makes a whole lot of difference in some ways what the structure is, whether or not it's an independent agency, whether or not it's something else, as long as it retains its credibility.
Would I be accurate if, so there's unanimous sentiment here that having a strong CEO that is managing the organization makes sense. Is that correct?
It makes a great deal of sense. I mean, CEO is one way to look at it. I would say professional management over the entire corpus of international broadcasting. There's nothing wrong with a board of advisors of some kind. I have no problem with that. But there needs to be a Berlin Wall put between them and the management of these enterprises.
Having a manager that can interact with state, that can interact with DoD, that can interact with security community, there's unanimous consent that with a board whose function is an oversight role. Is that a reasonable structure?
It's a reasonable structure, yes.
Great. You know what, I think this is an incredibly important topic for us to continue to discuss, to make the, to win the information war, to win the, we know based on our values as Americans, our values of freedom and democracy, when we get those values out there, they win. But if we're not effectively getting that message out there, then we face severe risks in losing to messages that are, that want to harm us. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Barra. Mr. Deutsch, my Florida colleague, is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, to you and the ranking member. Thanks for holding today's hearing. And I understand that that you touched on this issue briefly, but I'd like to just pursue a little further the role that we play in Iran. And while I believe public broadcasting is vitally important around the world, it's especially true there. We've got few opportunities to speak directly to the people, to present accurate information about their government's choices and about American values. And our primary tool for reaching out to the Iranian people is Voice of America's Persian News Network. PNN's long been considered an ineffective diplomatic tool, however, plagued by poor programming, low-quality production, and mismanagement. It's tremendously unfortunate in a country where an estimated 90% of the populace gets their news from TV. The U.S., via the Persian News Network, is missing an opportunity to have an influential role in Iran by presenting, too often, by presenting unprofessional, low-quality newscasts, often with an incoherent message. Less than 2 weeks ago, as the Iranian people went to the polls in historic numbers, BBC Persian provided 24/7 coverage of the elections. Yet PNN instead chose to broadcast a music program and a show about historical maps instead of continuous election news. Unfortunately, none of these criticisms are new. As Iran remains a top foreign policy concern, I'm seriously concerned that we're missing a vital opportunity to reach an estimated 25 to 30 million people in Iran. So my question is this. Why is the production quality and editorial content of PNN so lacking? What barriers are there preventing the hiring and training of top journalists? And then I'll just also ask, in a hearing before the Middle East Subcommittee, Kareem Sajipur of the Carnegie Endowment suggested that PNN become a public-private partnership. This was alluded to earlier in the hearing. If you could elaborate about your thoughts on that and help us understand what can be done to make this a more effective diplomatic tool.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Deutsch. I agree with your assessment. I have not looked closely at PNN for about 6 months or so, but everything you every characterization that you just made, I would agree with. PNN's a real tough nut to crack. It wasn't put together well in the beginning. It was rushed. It went from about an hour and a half of programming to 6 hours over a year period. I can't think of any commercial station that could do that. I did a very thorough, I think a very thorough study of PNN when I joined the board in 2010 at the request of Senator Coburn. I'd be happy to share that with you. It addresses all of the questions you've just raised. But let me address one of the possible solutions for you. PNN is unlikely to be fixed because the issues are largely connected to personnel. It is unlikely to be fixed as long as it remains within the Voice of America. If you want a solution to PNN, take it out of the Voice of America like you did the Iraq broadcasting and when you created the Middle East Broadcast Network, and attach PNN to Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, where it will be with its sister station, FARDA. The entire legal regime that affects the management of personnel will change, and you will see, my guess is, something happen fairly quickly.
Well, I'd be happy to look at the report, but if you could just give me the upshot of the conclusion, and I understand the suggestion to do what you just described, but what is it when you say that it's mostly personnel? So what does that mean? What needs to happen for that to change? Who makes the decisions to put programming on about historic maps on an election day with very significant implications for the entire country and the world?
Those decisions are taken by the chief editor of the Persian News Network, and I don't know who that is these days. But I mean, the stories of this the stories like that are just legendary, and PNN doesn't seem to overcome them. I could tell you a bunch of them myself, but I won't waste your time with them. But presumably, a chief editor, a head of service, is making those decisions.
Do we have these problems do we have these problems anywhere else in the world to this extent?
I would say from my experience, I mean, look, these are media organizations, so every now and then there's going to be a slip up. And there is in almost every one of the services at one point or another. The big services, the most high-profile services are the ones that get the attention. And we all wring our hands and we say, my God, why are we doing this so badly? The reality is, in most cases, we do it really well. We're really good at this. But there are going to be slip-ups. I can't think, in my experience, of any component of U.S. international broadcasting that has been so consistently below the curve as PNN.
Mr. Deutsch, I think your question reflects some of what I've been trying to say about mission and strategy. So imagine if the mission were clarified for the BBG, and forget about a restructuring, but even if there were restructuring, it would be even easier. But there's an election coming up in Iran. The National Security Advisor or the Secretary of State, or both of them, bring the CEO of the BBG into the White House, and they say, hey, this is really important. We would like you to direct these resources at this issue. That doesn't happen now, and in fact, it can't happen now in any way where the BBG actually has to take notice of that.
Well, why, if I can just ask, is the mission so unclear, is it so muddled that it would be impossible for the editors, for the people who run the station, to know that on an election day, when the entire world is focusing on your country, that the news network might actually cover the news taking place in that country? And if so, how do we fix that? How do we clarify the mission? Who needs to do it? Who needs to be told? What has to happen so that they actually behave like a news network, so that the Iranian people can get good, can get clear, real news from this outlet?
I think the clarification of mission has to be done by the U.S. Congress. There's no doubt about that. There are personnel problems within PNN. I've been out of it now for 4 years. So I can't really talk to it as well as my colleague here. But you know, there's no doubt that that's part of the problem. I'm trying to say that there's a bigger problem here, which is that there would be a lack of responsiveness on the part of the BBG and PNN to those directives, because that's not what they do. They don't want to be told by somebody that this is your role in achieving a national security end. You're supposed to do this, guys. Do it. That's not the way it works now.
Just the last question, Madam Chair. What percentage of their funding comes from the United States government?
PNN?
Yeah.
All of it.
All of it.
Okay, thanks. I yield back.
Thank you so much. We thank our witnesses for this timely hearing, and I again remind our witnesses, our audience and members, that the mission of the Broadcasting Board of Governors is, quote, to inform, engage, and connect people around the world in support of freedom and democracy, end quote. This is broadcast for freedom and democracy. If you think that this is an impartial broadcasting, then you're not fulfilling your mission, because you are supposed to stand for freedom and democracy. That is a direction. That is what the BBG is supposed to do. We don't have to change the mission. We have to change the folks who are in charge of the programming, who don't have any idea what their mission is. So this is an important mission. It's of great interest to this committee. Support for freedom and democracy. Amen. You've given us a lot of information for us to move forward, and this hearing is now adjourned.